Hello, my name is Jason, and I have decided to make a very low-tech video series discussing a topic that is very important to me, and I'm just going to name it the de-spiritualization of our modern society. So right off the bat, I'm going to have to define terms and do a quick outline of what I intend to talk about in this series. So when I say the de-spiritualization of our society, let me just say that our society, from my perspective, is the USA, where I'm a citizen and where I live. But this probably can be applied to many societies, especially first world countries around the world, where I believe de-spiritualization is probably also taking place. Okay, so what do I mean by de-spiritualization? So to discuss this term, I'll use the root of it, which is spirit. And I'm going to define spirit in a fairly non-religious way, I hope. And that is, the spirit would be the part of us that is not physical. Now, we'll get into that later as to why that's important and why that makes a difference. But for right now, I'm just going to say the spirit is that part of it which is not physical. For some people, this might imply that it's the part that lives on after the body dies. It does, we'll look later how that the idea of a spirit could definitely play a role in things like free will and love and morality and things like that. It should also be pointed out that because I'm going to define the spirit as that part of us which is not physical, that does mean that I cannot just demonstrate scientifically that there is such a thing as a spirit, and given that definition, nobody can, since science, which will be my next definition, although I don't really need to define science since we're all familiar with it, but science is man's way of understanding the physical world. I want to be upfront that I have nothing against science, and none of these talks should come across as me being against science. Science is our best way of understanding the physical world. But since the spirit is not a physical entity, science can really do very little to either prove or disprove its existence, certainly very little to understand it, and so on. So, but we will discuss science, especially later on, when we find that science and intuition will meet later on in science fiction. Speaking of which, intuition will be another term I'll be using. Intuition would be our way of understanding things that is not scientific. It's a way of understanding things, it's a way of knowing without really being able to prove or demonstrate that you know it. It's something you just know. Now, this is harder to accept because that part of the reason is we'll discuss later, one of the reasons we're living in despiritualized times is science has ascended so far that it has kind of kicked the idea of spirituality to the curb. And by spirituality, I do mean the idea that we have a spirit and we attend to that spirit in some way. So science obviously cannot really address the spirit issue very directly at all. So how do we know about a spirit? I'm going to use the word intuition. Now, it might be best if I give an example of what I mean by intuition. I mentioned earlier that I am a citizen of the USA, and as such, I'm rather familiar with our Constitution. I hope everyone, wherever you're from, is fairly familiar with your country's Constitution, assuming you have one. And a common, very well-known phrase from that Constitution is the phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, and that they are endowed with their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, they do mention a Creator in there, and I'm not going to focus on that because that's not of huge concern at this point. although it's almost implied, because when I'm going to focus on the phrase self-evident. If a truth is self-evident, well, that means it doesn't need to be demonstrated. It's self-evident. We just know it. That's another way of saying we just know it. It's self-evident. And so what is self-evident, according to the founding fathers of the USA, is that people have certain rights just because they're people. Now, this is important. This is important because without the idea of a spirit, I think it'd be difficult to make those claims that people have certain rights. Because without a spirit, people would really be no different from animals. We would just happen to be perhaps the most evolved species on the planet, the most intelligent species on the planet, or third behind dolphins and mice, if you're familiar with that reference. But in any case, we intuit that humans should have certain rights. And we don't like the idea of those rights being taken away. And a lot of science fiction, you'll find out, deals with the idea of man solving their problems, but at the expense of taking away what appear to be basic human rights. And we'll get into that later when we discuss science fiction. You'll find out later that I'm a pretty big fan of science fiction, and one reason for that is I believe science fiction brings together the two ideas of science and intuition. I think most people who write science fiction and most people who read science fiction are fans of science. And yet, in science fiction, we often see that a purely scientific, or in other words, a purely physical view of the world seems to be missing something. There seems to be something that's not quite right. And we'll discuss that later when I get into discussing science fiction. So, I'm going to try to keep all of these talks under 15 minutes for my own sake. And I don't know if that will make fewer ads or something as well. But so just to recap, I'm going to talk about de-spiritualization. And I'm going to be using some terms. When I say spirit, I'm just talking about a part of the human being that is not physical. De-spiritualization is the idea that we're not paying attention to this part of us. Either we're denying it exists completely, or we might acknowledge it exists, but we really don't tend to it in any way. Science is our way of understanding the physical world. There's nothing wrong with science. It understands the physical world better than anything else. And it has done great things for mankind in the realm of the physical, especially these days in terms of medical breakthroughs and medical science that has allowed humans to live healthier and longer lives. And intuition, which is our way of knowing something that we just know, a so-called self-evident truth. And most of these are directed towards existential issues like the existence of God and what it means to be a human being, which is covered a lot in science fiction as well. Now, so to break it down, I will be talking about those issues, those terms in a little more depth. And of course, we'll also look at the idea of, well, what's the matter with de-spiritualization? Well, I think on a common sense level, if there is such a thing as a spirit, and we pay no attention to it, we would expect there has to be some kind of a negative consequence, because that's the way reality works. If there's something in reality that affects us and we ignore that thing, the effects will be there and we're not prepared for them. A good example in the physical world would be germs. We know that germs have always been around and they've always had an impact on us. And when we discovered germs and learned and studied them and were able to deal with them, it greatly increased health benefits. Just from sanitation and hygiene alone, a lot of sickness and death has been prevented. But of course, we understand germs even better than that, and we've developed all kinds of strategies to deal with germs. Now, a germ, of course, is well, the bad germs anyway, the ones that harm us, are considered a bad thing, whereas the spirit is not. But the point is the same. If they exist and are affecting us, it's not wise to remain ignorant of them. It's not wise to ignore them. So if we have a spirit, and that's going to be the big if, right? If we have a spirit, to live as though we did not, to say that we don't have one, or basically live as though we do not have one, is going to have an effect. So this is what I'm going to deal with. I'm going to deal with what could the effects be, what's causing this despiritualization, and where we go from here, if we go anywhere, depending on whether or not you find anything I say useful. So they'll end my first discussion, or not discussion, I'm just talking, I guess. Maybe it could become a discussion if people want to join in. But I'm going to end there to keep it short. Next time, I'm going to be dealing a little more in depth with the idea of intuition. And then I think the third one will go on to something else. Okay. Again, I'll try to keep these all under 15 minutes. So thank you for tuning in for talk number 1, and I hope you'll tune in to talk number 2.